My son looked me in the eye in front of 47 employees, the people I had hired, trained, and stood beside through every crisis this company had ever faced. And he said, "Dad, the business is mine now. You built it, and I respect that. But it's my turn." And the room went so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit I had installed in that building in 1987 when there was nothing in it except one truck, a metal desk, and a phone that rang maybe twice a day if I was lucky. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I looked at my son standing at the head of the conference table in the building I had built from the ground up with 35 years of decisions that cost me more than he will ever fully understand. And I said, "Marcus, you forgot one thing." He smiled the smile of a man who believes he has already won. And then someone behind him spoke. And when Marcus turned around and saw who it was, the color left his face so completely and so quickly that I watched it happen the way you watch something fall before it hits the ground, in the terrible slow motion of a moment that cannot be stopped or taken back. But I need to tell you how we got to that conference room, because what happened in those 60 seconds at that table was 35 years in the making. And if I skip to the ending, you will not understand the weight of it. And the weight of it is the whole point. If this opening already hit something in you, if you have ever watched someone treat your life's work like it was simply theirs to take, hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel so you do not miss what happens next. Because I promise you, by the end of this story, you will understand exactly what my son forgot, and you will never forget it either. My name is Gerald Sutton, and I want to be precise about what that name means in the freight and logistics industry in Middle Tennessee, because precision is the habit that kept me alive in this business when everything around me was trying to put me under. I am 68 years old, and I founded Sutton Freight and Logistics in Nashville in the spring of 1987 with $11,000, a used Kenworth T600 that needed a new clutch before I had made a single delivery, and the particular combination of stubbornness and terror that I have since come to understand is the only reliable fuel for building something from nothing. I had no investors, no family money, no connections in the industry, and no fallback plan, because a fallback plan is something you have when failure is an option you are willing to consider. And failure was never an option I was willing to consider. Not with Dorothy waiting at home, not with Marcus on the way. Dorothy was my wife for 31 years, and she was the kind of person whose presence made everything around her more honest. She had a way of looking at a situation and identifying exactly what was true about it and exactly what was being avoided. And she did it without cruelty and without performance, simply as a matter of how she moved through the world. She kept the books for Sutton Freight for the first 12 years while working a full-time job as a school administrator and raising Marcus, and never once complained about the hours or the pressure or the years when the margin between making payroll and not making payroll was thin enough that I could not sleep on Sunday nights. She used to say that she had not married a man, she had married a direction, and that she intended to keep moving in it regardless of the terrain. She died of a stroke 3 years ago on a Tuesday morning in October, and I have not had a full night of sleep since. Not because of grief exactly, though grief is part of it, but because Dorothy was the person I processed everything with, and without her the processing happened slower and less completely, and the things that need to be understood take longer to become understood. By the time Dorothy died, Sutton Freight and Logistics was a regional operation with 47 employees, a fleet of 23 trucks, warehouse facilities in Nashville, Knoxville, and Chattanooga, and a client roster that had taken 35 years to build one relationship at a time. The most important of those relationships was with Raymond Crowell, the founder and majority owner of Crowell Manufacturing, a mid-sized industrial parts manufacturer based in Murfreesboro, whose shipping and logistics needs had kept Sutton Freight in business through 2 recessions, 1 industry-wide fuel crisis, and the kind of slow, difficult years that break companies that are not built on something stronger than a profit margin. Raymond and I had shaken hands on our first contract in 1994 when he had 12 employees and I had 4 trucks, and neither of us had any particular reason to trust the other, except that we were both men who had built things with our hands and our decisions, and we recognized that quality in each other the way people recognize a language they grew up speaking. 28 years later, Crowell Manufacturing accounted for 34% of Sutton Freight's annual revenue, And Raymond Crowell was the closest thing to a best friend I had outside of Dorothy, which is to say he was one of approximately 3 people on earth I trusted completely and without reservation. Marcus came into the business at 28, a decade after graduating from the University of Tennessee, with a business degree that taught him the language of commerce without teaching him the thing that language is supposed to describe. He was talented. I want to say that clearly because it is true, and because I am not interested in making my son a villain in order to make myself a hero. He had Dorothy's instincts with people and a genuine aptitude for the operational side of logistics that surprised me in the early years, because I had not expected him to care about the details the way you have to care about details in this industry. He learned quickly and he worked hard, and over the first 5 years, I gave him progressively more responsibility because he had earned it, and because I believed, as fathers tend to believe, about the things they have built and the children they have raised, that the values behind both were the same and would remain the same as long as I was there to model them. I was wrong about that. Not about Marcus's talent, about the values staying the same when the power started shifting. It happened slowly the way the important deteriorations always happen, not in a single visible break, but in the accumulation of small decisions that individually seem reasonable and collectively describe something you did not agree to and would not have agreed to if you had seen the whole picture at once. It started 3 years ago, 6 months after Dorothy died, when Marcus began making operational decisions without consulting me. Not large decisions at first, vendor changes, route adjustments, small personnel matters that fell within the scope of his role as operations director. I noticed but said nothing because grief had taken up most of the space inside me, and because I told myself that Marcus stepping up was what Dorothy would have wanted, that loosening my grip was the natural progression of a business transitioning to its next generation. I told myself that for approximately 18 months before the decision stopped being small. The first large decision he made without me was the termination of our warehouse manager in Knoxville, a man named Dale Pritchard, who had worked for Sutton Freight for 19 years and who was one of the most reliable people I had ever employed. Marcus let Dale go on a Friday afternoon and told me about it the following Monday in a tone that made clear he considered it already resolved and not particularly open to discussion. When I asked why, Marcus said Dale was resistant to the new systems and that the Knoxville operation needed leadership aligned with the direction the company was moving in. I asked what direction the company was moving in. Marcus looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before, patient and slightly condescending. The expression of someone explaining something obvious to someone they have decided is no longer the right person to be explaining it to. And he said, "Forward, Dad." The same direction it always has been. And he moved on to the next item on his agenda before I had finished processing the first one. Dale Pritchard called me that evening from Knoxville. He did not ask for his job back. He called because he wanted me to know something that Marcus had not mentioned in his Monday morning summary. Before Marcus let Dale go, he had spent 3 months systematically removing Dale's name from client communications and replacing it with the name of a younger manager he had brought in from outside without telling me. He had been building the transition for a quarter of a year before executing it, which meant the decision I had been told about on a Monday was not a decision at all, but the final step of a plan that had been in motion since before I had any knowledge of it. I thanked Dale for calling. I sat in my kitchen in Nashville for a long time after that conversation, and I thought about Dorothy and about what she would have identified as true in this situation and what she would have said was being avoided. And I thought about Raymond Crowell and the contract renewal meeting that was scheduled for the following month, the largest single contract renewal in the history of Sutton Freight. And I made a decision that I did not tell Marcus about because I had learned from watching him that sometimes the most important plans are the ones you keep to yourself until the moment they need to be executed. I want to tell you about the morning I understood that what Marcus was doing was not a transition, it was a removal. I arrived at the Nashville office at 6:45 the way I had arrived every single working day for 35 years, before anyone else. Because the first hour in a freight operation is the hour that determines everything that follows, and I had never been willing to hand that hour to another person, regardless of how much I trusted them. I pulled into the parking lot and sat in my truck for a moment, the way I always did, Looking at the building the way you look at something you constructed with your own hands, and that still surprises you sometimes by existing exactly as you imagined it. And that was when I noticed the silver Audi parked in my space. Not near my space. In my space, the spot that had always been mine, not because my name was painted on the asphalt, but because everyone at Sutton Freight understood, without being told, that some things carry an order to them that does not require a sign. I parked 2 spots over and went inside without saying anything about it, because I had learned a long time ago that the things worth addressing are worth addressing at the right moment and not before. Inside the conference room, Marcus was sitting with 2 men I had never seen before, both of them in their late 30s, with the particular polished efficiency of people who work in finance or consulting and who are accustomed to walking into rooms and rearranging what they find there. There were laptops open and papers spread across the table and coffee cups that told me they had been there for some time before I arrived. Marcus looked up when I came in, and something moved across his face for less than a second. Not quite guilt and not quite surprise, before the composure returned and he said, "Dad, good morning. These are colleagues of mine from a consulting group I have been working with on some structural analysis of our operations. Nothing to worry about." He said nothing to worry about the way people say it when the thing they are describing is precisely the thing you should be worried about. I looked at the papers on the table, and 35 years of reading freight documents tells you what you are looking at within about 4 seconds, regardless of the formatting or the language used to dress it up. What was spread across that table was not a structural analysis of operations. It was a valuation assessment, a document calculating what Sutton Freight and Logistics was worth broken down by asset category, client contract value, regional market position, and projected revenue under alternative ownership structures. I had commissioned one myself in 2019 when Raymond Crowell had asked whether I had ever considered taking on a silent partner to fund a Memphis expansion, and I knew exactly what the format looked like and exactly what it meant that one was sitting on my conference table at 7 in the morning with 2 strangers I had never met leaning over it. I asked Marcus calmly who had commissioned the assessment, and he said he had. And I asked when, and he said over the past 2 months, and I asked why he had not mentioned it to me, and he said he had not wanted to add to my burden while I was still grieving Dorothy, that it was preliminary and exploratory, and that naturally he would have brought it to me before anything moved forward. He delivered all of this in the tone of a man reciting a prepared explanation, each sentence arriving with a slightly over-rehearsed smoothness of something that has been said internally many times before being said out loud for the first time. I thanked the consultants for their time and asked them to give us a few minutes, and they gathered their laptops with the professional neutrality of people paid well enough to be comfortable in awkward situations and stepped out into the hallway. And I sat across from my son at the table I had built this company around, and I looked at him the way Dorothy used to look at situations she needed to see all the way through before she responded, completely and without flinching. And I said, "Marcus, I want you to tell me what this actually is. Not the version you prepared, the real thing underneath it." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I have not stopped thinking about since that morning. Not because it was cruel, though it landed with the particular force of something that is true in the worst possible way, but because it was the first moment I understood with complete clarity what I was dealing with and what it was going to cost me to deal with it correctly. He said, "Dad, you built something remarkable here, and I mean that genuinely, but the industry is changing faster than you are comfortable with, and the decisions you would make from here are going to cost this company opportunities it cannot afford to miss. And I am not trying to push you out. I am trying to protect what you built from the decisions you would make if I allowed you to keep making them." I stood up and told him I needed time to think, and he nodded with the expression of a man who believes the thinking has already been done for you, and that you simply have not arrived at the conclusion he has been waiting for. I walked down the hall to my office and closed the door and sat at Dorothy's desk, the one she had refused to let me replace when we moved to this building in 2004, because she said it had the right history, and that you do not discard things with the right history simply because something newer is available. And I sat there for a long time looking at the photograph on the wall behind my monitor, the one taken in 1994 when we added our 5th truck to the fleet. Dorothy in her red coat with Marcus on her hip squinting into the sun, Raymond Crowell behind the camera because he had driven over from Murfreesboro specifically to mark the occasion. And I made a decision that I did not share with anyone. 3 weeks later, Marcus called a company-wide meeting, and I want you to understand what that meant because in 35 years, I had called exactly 9 company-wide meetings, and each one marked something that genuinely required every person in the building to hear the same words at the same time. A new contract that changed our scale, a recession year that required shared sacrifice. The morning I told 47 people that Dorothy was gone. Marcus had never called one before because that had always been my domain, and everyone at Sutton Freight understood that without it ever being stated as a policy. I walked into the operations floor at 3 that Wednesday afternoon, and I saw the screen at the front of the room displaying a new version of the Sutton Freight logo, the same dark blue letters Dorothy and I had chosen together but redesigned, cleaner and more contemporary, and beneath them in smaller text a tagline I had never seen or approved. Sutton Freight and Logistics, moving forward. I stood at the back of the room and looked at that screen and understood in the space of about 10 seconds that my presence in this meeting had been designed as part of the presentation, rather than as a participant in any decision, that whatever was about to happen had been planned for a long time, and that the invitation I had received that morning to attend had been the final detail of a plan that was already complete. Marcus stood at the front and spoke about the freight industry and where it was going and what Sutton Freight needed to do to remain competitive over the next decade. And he was genuinely good. I keep saying that because it keeps being true. He had Dorothy's instincts with people, and he had built a vision for the company that was coherent and ambitious and that I could hear had been constructed without a single conversation with me. And then he said, "Before we talk about where we are going, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the man who built the foundation we are standing on." And he gestured toward me at the back of the room, and 47 heads turned at once. And I stood there in my jacket with my hands at my sides while my son described my legacy and my contribution and the respect the entire company had for what I had created. He used the word remarkable. He used the word foundation. He talked about me the way you talk about someone at a retirement dinner, present tense achievements delivered in the past tense cadence of something that has already concluded. And when he finished, he began to applaud, and 47 people applauded with him. And I stood at the back of the room being honored for something that was not over and that I had not agreed to end. And I understood that Marcus had chosen this as the moment to make my removal official, not as a termination, not as a confrontation, but as a celebration, presented to 47 witnesses as something already decided that was now simply being announced with appropriate gratitude. I applauded with them. I smiled and nodded at the people near me, who were watching me with expressions ranging from genuine warmth to barely concealed discomfort, and I held myself completely still inside because the alternative was a confrontation before Raymond Crowell was in the room, and that was the only confrontation that was going to matter. After the meeting, Tommy Briggs, my lead dispatcher of 22 years, found me in the hallway outside my office and took my hand and held it one beat longer than a handshake requires and said, "Gerald, I just want you to know." And he did not finish the sentence because he did not need to, and we both understood that. I drove home that evening and sat in the kitchen in the house Dorothy and I had shared for 26 years and looked at the chair across the table where she used to sit in the mornings with her coffee and her yellow legal pad where she kept her lists. And I felt for the first time since February something genuinely close to defeat. Not the clean, definitive kind, but the slower and more corrosive kind. The defeat of a thing being taken from you piece by piece in a way designed to make you feel that resistance is the unreasonable position, that insisting on remaining is a failure to accept and honor being offered. Marcus had not fired me. He had celebrated me in front of 47 people, and that had been more effective than any termination because it had given the removal the appearance of something mutual and dignified and concluded. I sat in that kitchen for 2 hours, and then I picked up the phone and called Raymond Crowell. He answered on the second ring the way he always answered, without preamble, as if the conversation had been going on for some time, and we were simply returning to it, and I told him everything. The valuation assessment and the consultants and the new logo and the applause and what it had felt like to stand at the back of the room being retired by my own son in front of the people I had spent 35 years building something real with. Raymond listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always valued most about him. The capacity to receive information completely before deciding what to do with it. And when I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Gerald, when is the contract renewal meeting?" I told him March 14th, 5 weeks away, and he said I will be there in person, and I told him he did not need to make the drive from Murfreesboro for a renewal we had handled by phone before. And he said, "I know I do not need to." And then he said, "The thing I held on to for the next 5 weeks, the way a load-bearing wall holds everything above it during a storm." He said, "You built that company on relationships your son did not build and cannot replace, and I want him to be in the room when he finds that out." I understood exactly what Raymond meant. I thanked him, and he told me to get some sleep, and I did, for the first time in weeks, because what had been missing since February was not a strategy and not a plan, but something simpler and more essential than either of those things. What had been missing was a witness, and now I had one. Over the following 5 weeks, Marcus continued the restructuring with the quiet efficiency of someone who believes the outcome is already settled and is simply managing the timeline toward a conclusion he has already written. He reorganized the reporting structure so that information reaching my office passed through him first and arrived edited, delayed, and occasionally not at all. He scheduled meetings with major clients under the Sutton Freight name without including me on the invitations. He had new business cards printed for the entire leadership team with his name listed as Chief Executive Officer and mine listed as Founder, which is the title given to men who used to matter and are being memorialized while still present. And he left a box of them on my desk one morning without a note, as if the reclassification were simply an administrative update that required no discussion. I said nothing. I attended what I was invited to and signed what required my signature, and let Marcus interpret my silence as acceptance, because the alternative was a confrontation before Raymond Crowell was in the room, and I had decided in Dorothy's kitchen on a February evening that I was going to wait for the right room. The morning of March 14, I arrived at the office at 6:45. I parked in my space, which was my space again, because the silver Audi now had a space of its own, with a small printed sign that read, Chief Executive Officer, a sign that had appeared 3 weeks earlier and that I had walked past every morning without comment. I went to my office and sat at Dorothy's desk and looked at the photograph on the wall and drank my coffee and waited. Raymond arrived at 9:15, and I met him in the parking lot, and we shook hands the way we had shaken hands for 28 years, firmly and without performance. The handshake of two men who have never needed to display their regard for each other because the regard was structural and therefore did not require demonstration. He looked at me with the calm of someone who has driven 50 miles to do one specific thing and is prepared to do it. And I said, "Thank you for coming, Raymond." And he said, "I would not have missed it, Gerald." And we walked inside together. Marcus was already in the conference room with 3 members of his restructured leadership team, all of them hired within the past 2 years. None of them old enough to remember the first Crowell manufacturing contract or the fuel crisis of 2008 or the February morning in 2011, when I had personally driven a truck from Nashville to Murfreesboro at 4 in the morning because our only available driver had called in sick and Raymond had a production deadline that could not move. Marcus looked up when we entered, and his expression moved through surprise and recalibration and professional composure in the space of about 2 seconds, and he stood and extended his hand to Raymond and said it was great to have him here and that they were looking forward to discussing the renewal, and Raymond shook his hand and said hello and sat down and gave nothing else away. Marcus opened his presentation with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed it many times. New operational metrics and expanded capacity projections and technology investments, and the full picture of a company moving with confidence into its next chapter. And it was genuinely impressive, and I kept giving him that because it kept being true. And Raymond listened with his hands folded on the table and his expression revealing nothing, which was the expression he used when he had already decided something and was simply waiting for the correct moment to say it out loud. When Marcus finished, he looked at Raymond and said he hoped this gave a clear picture of where Sutton Freight was heading and that he was excited to continue building the relationship with Crowell Manufacturing into this next chapter. And Raymond nodded slowly and looked at the materials on the table, and then looked at Marcus with the quality of attention that people with decades of experience deploy when they are about to say something permanent. He said, "Marcus, before we discuss the contract, I have one question for you." Marcus said, "Of course," and smiled the smile of a man who has prepared for every possible question. Raymond said, "How many of the Crowell manufacturing drivers know your name?" The smile stayed on Marcus's face for about 2 seconds after the question landed, and then something behind his eyes began the complicated process of understanding what had just been asked and, more importantly, why. And I watched that process complete itself in real time, the way you watch a structure absorb a load it was not designed to carry, with a particular quality of stillness that precedes an adjustment that cannot be reversed. He said he was not sure he understood the relevance of the question, and Raymond said, "I know you are not sure. And that is exactly why I'm asking it." And the room went so quiet that I could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit I had installed in this building in 1987, when there was nothing in it except one truck and a metal desk and a phone that rang twice a day if I was lucky. Marcus looked at me for the first time since the meeting had begun, a quick, involuntary glance that lasted less than a second, but that everyone in the room caught because the room was paying the kind of attention that rooms pay when something is happening that no amount of preparation can script around. And then he looked back at Raymond and said that he had been focused primarily on the operational and strategic dimensions of the business, and that driver relationships had been managed at the department level. And Raymond listened to all of that with the patience of a man who had already decided that the answer did not matter nearly as much as the fact that it had taken that long to arrive. Raymond reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a document on the conference table and slid it toward the center where everyone could see it. It was a letter, handwritten, 2 pages, and at the bottom of the second page there were signatures, 41 of them, written in the various handwriting styles of 41 different people. Marcus looked at the letter and then at Raymond, and Raymond said, "That is a letter from every Crowell manufacturing employee who has had direct contact with Sutton Freight over the past 28 years, and who is still with our company, drivers and warehouse staff, and receiving managers and dispatch coordinators, 41 people who have been moving our freight and protecting our deadlines through 2 recessions and a fuel crisis and every other thing this industry has thrown at both of our companies since 1994. I asked each of them to write down what they needed me to know before I signed any long-term renewal contract with this organization, and I asked them what this relationship meant to them and what they needed to feel confident about before I committed Crowell Manufacturing to another decade with Sutton Freight." He paused and let the room hold that for a moment, the way a good room holds the weight of what is said inside it. "Not one of those 41 letters mentioned your name," he said, looking directly at Marcus with the steady, undeflectable gaze of a man who has been building things for 50 years and has no remaining patience for performances. "Every single one of them mentioned your father. They wrote about the morning in 2011 when Gerald drove a truck himself at 4 in the morning because we had a deadline and he had a sick driver, and he did not consider any other option. They wrote about the fuel crisis of 2008 when Gerald called me personally before he called his own bank to make sure Crowell Manufacturing's contracts would be honored, regardless of what happened to his margins that quarter. They wrote about the drivers he hired who became part of their loading dock routines for 15 and 18 and 20 years. Men and women Gerald chose because he understood that reliability is not a metric you find in a software dashboard. It is a quality you recognize in a person when you have been in this industry long enough to know what you're looking at. 41 people wrote letters about your father, and not one of them mentioned you, and I want you to sit with that for a moment before we continue this conversation. The 3 members of Marcus's restructured leadership team were looking at the table in front of them with the careful stillness of people who understand they are witnessing something they were not supposed to witness and who have decided that complete invisibility is the only appropriate response. Marcus sat at the head of the table where he had stood an hour earlier, delivering a presentation about the future of a company he believed he had already secured. And I watched the understanding move through him the way understanding moves through a person, when the architecture of something they built reveals itself to be resting on a foundation they did not construct and cannot claim. slowly at first and then all at once, and with a weight that does not leave room for the composed recalibration he had deployed every other time something had not gone according to the plan. And that was the moment. That was the moment I had been waiting for since the February morning, with the silver Audi in my parking space and the consultants with their laptops and the valuation assessment spread across my conference table. Not to humiliate my son, not to win an argument or reclaim a title or prove a point about who had built what and therefore owned what. I had been waiting for the moment when Marcus would understand the thing that cannot be taught in a business school or demonstrated in a presentation or transferred through a restructured reporting hierarchy. The thing Dorothy had understood from the very beginning, and that Raymond Crowell had understood from the moment we shook hands in 1994, and that 41 people had understood well enough to write it down in letters that had traveled from Murfreesboro to Nashville in the inside pocket of a man who had driven 50 miles because some things deserve a witness. I looked at my son and I said, Marcus, the business is yours. I mean that. You have the talent and the vision, and I believe in both of those things genuinely and without reservation. But a business is not its assets, and it is not its metrics, and it is not the title on a business card or the logo on a screen in a conference room. A business is the relationships built by the people who showed up before anyone else and stayed after everyone else left and made the calls at 4 in the morning that nobody asked them to make and kept the promises that were never written into any contract. Because some promises are kept, not because they are binding, but because the person who made them understands that their word is the only asset that cannot be replaced if lost. You inherited a company. What you have not yet built is the thing that makes this company worth inheriting. And until you understand the difference between those two things, the 41 letters in that document are the most important business education you will ever receive. Marcus looked at the letter on the table for a long time without speaking. And then he looked at me, and what was in his face was not the composed professionalism of the past 14 months, and it was not the expression of a man executing a plan, and it was not anything he had prepared. It was the expression of someone who has just seen something clearly for the first time, and who is in the early painful stages of understanding what the clarity costs. He said, Dad, I did not know about the 2011 drive. I said, I know, son. He said, why did you never tell me? I said, because the point of doing it was not the telling. The point was the doing. And that is the thing I should have found a better way to teach you. Raymond picked up the letter from the table and replaced it in the inside pocket of his jacket and looked at Marcus with the expression of a man who has delivered what he came to deliver and is now prepared to discuss what comes next. He said, I am going to sign the renewal contract today because Sutton Freight has earned that contract 28 years of mornings at a time. And because I believe the foundation Gerald built is strong enough to hold what you are trying to build on top of it. But I want you to understand something clearly before I do. The day that foundation stops being honored is the day I find a different carrier. And there is no presentation and no metric and no restructured operational hierarchy that changes that. What I am signing today is a contract with this company's history as much as with its future. And the two things are not separable no matter how clean the new logo looks. He signed the contract, slid it across the table, and stood up and shook Marcus's hand, and then turned to me. And we shook hands the way we had shaken hands for 28 years. And he held it a moment longer than usual, and looked at me with the expression of a man who has done the thing he drove 50 miles to do, and who considers it done correctly. And then he said, goodbye, Gerald. And I said, thank you, Raymond. And he walked out of the conference room and down the hall and out into the March morning. And I watched him go through the window the way you watch someone who has just held something important for you walk back into their own life. Marcus and I stayed in that conference room for a long time after Raymond left, and we did not resolve everything. And I want to be honest with you about that, because the stories that resolve everything in a single afternoon are not true stories. They are the versions we tell when we want the weight of things to be lighter than it actually is. What we did was begin. And beginning after 14 months of drift and removal and applause for something that was not over was enough for that day. It was more than enough. On the drive home through Nashville in the last of the March light, I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket, and I found what I had put there that morning before leaving the house. A photograph, small and slightly worn at the edges, Dorothy in her red coat in front of 5 trucks in 1994, with Marcus on her hips squinting into the sun, and Raymond Crowell somewhere behind the camera because he had driven over from Murfreesboro specifically to mark the occasion. Because even then he understood that certain moments in the building of a thing deserve a witness. I held that photograph on the seat beside me the rest of the way home, and I thought about how 35 years of mornings that nobody saw and promises kept, because keeping them was the only version of this work I had ever known how to do, had fit themselves into one room on one March morning and had been enough. Dorothy always said they would be. She was right. She was almost always right. If you have ever built something with your hands and your time and the hours nobody counted, if you have ever stood at the back of a room being honored for something that was not over, if you have ever had to wait for the right moment before saying the thing that needed to be said, then you already know what Gerald Sutton knows and what Raymond Crowell drove 50 miles to remind a room full of people, that what lasts is never the presentation and never the logo and never the title on the business card. What lasts is what you built when nobody was watching and the relationships that remember it long after you have stopped keeping count. Hit that like button right now if this story reached you, and subscribe to this channel so you do not miss what comes next. Because every week we are here with another story about the people who built something real and refused to let it be taken quietly. Leave a comment and tell me, have you ever had to wait for the right room before you said what needed to be said? I read every single one.